For I have given you an example, that you should also do as I have done to you. John 13:15. Dear Lord Jesus, we come before you with hearts full of gratitude for your unwavering love and devotion. Thank you for setting a perfect example of service and humility as you washed the feet of your disciples. Your sacrifice on the cross, where you laid down your life for us, is the ultimate act of love and service, and we are forever grateful. We recognize that without your guidance and strength, we are incapable of truly loving and serving others as you've commanded us. Please empower each of us to lay down our comforts, our conveniences, and our egos, so that others may thrive. Help us to see opportunities to serve those around us, just as you have served us. Give us the strength and courage to follow your example in our daily lives. And may we be instruments of your love and grace, bringing hope and healing to a world in need. We ask this in your precious name, Jesus. Amen. Thank you for praying with me. You're listening to the Jesus Podcast, stories inspired by the gospel to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. Be sure to follow this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. Judas stood before the chief priests. His legs trembled. He did everything he could to make sure his voice didn't.
Yes, I know where Jesus of Nazareth is staying.
And you say you're willing to turn him over to us? You're one of his followers, are you not? What brings you to such a sudden change of heart?
He says he's the Messiah, and I believe it, but he doesn't act like it. We have pinched every last mite for 3 years, and what do we have to show for it? He could turn stones into bread, or bring all the nations to bow down to him. But all we do is travel, teach, and try not to get stoned.
The chief priest could sense that Judas was distraught.
Very well. As long as we're all aligned on the end goal, I believe we can come up with a mutually beneficial contract. We'll discuss an amount with the temple treasury, and you will secure a place away from the people where we can apprehend Jesus once and for all.
The chief priest led Judas to the door. He stepped out into the temple courtyards as worshippers made their way in and out of the temple to make their sacrifices. His eyes darted around, looking for any familiar faces. The coast was clear. His heart pounded heavily in his chest. He closed his eyes tightly and breathed slowly. His mind darted to Jesus and the disciples. He looked up at the tawny sky. Evening was approaching.
They'll likely be preparing the meal. If I'm quick, no one should notice I've been gone.
Judas thought to himself as he hurried down the street. He bumped into the merchants closing up their shops for the evening. He glanced over his shoulder in a nervous reflex. He felt himself collide with a jar. He looked down just as it spilled water along the dusty street.
In a hurry, I see. Late for Passover?
I'm so sorry. Please, allow me to get that for you.
Judas promptly set the vessel upright. But the shopkeeper seemed more concerned with Judas than he was with the jar.
Are you all right? You seem a little frazzled, especially on a day of celebration like today.
Frazzled. Yes, you could say that.
May Adonai be with you and give you peace.
Judas considered the man's words. Peace. That was something Judas hadn't felt for some time. The irony in the man's words was not lost on the rogue disciple. Judas muttered a thanks and continued on. His sandals sunk into the miry clay he had unintentionally created in the ground. He looked down. There was no time to care about his feet. He needed to get to the Passover meal before anyone noticed he was gone.
Are you in pain after walking, running, or even just standing? It's not your feet, it's your shoes. This summer, switch to G-Defy shoes with patented VersoShock technology, which aligns your body, provides superior shock absorption, and trampoline-like energy return. G-Defy offers soles and styles for any activity, plus 2 free orthotics. Whether you're an athlete, a busy parent, or always on the go, G-Defy shoes deliver the comfort and versatility your feet crave. Say goodbye to discomfort and hello to unparalleled support this summer. Enjoy a special summer offer. Visit gdefy.com and get $20 off your order of $100 or more with code PRAY. Experience the miracle of ultimate comfort with G-Defy shoes. Visit gdefy.com today.
The great and mighty creator of the universe knelt down and washed the dirty feet of his followers. This type of humility is staggering and challenges our notions on greatness. This is the Jesus Podcast. I'm Ethan with pray.com. Today, we continue through our mini-series on Jesus disrupting the status quo and showing us a new way to live. This series showcases Jesus' teachings and passion, and we'll learn about God's heart for people and his kingdom. Today, we're going to reflect on a powerful moment in the life of Jesus, a moment that beautifully illustrates his heart and his mission. Today's story is inspired by John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17, where Jesus, the King of Kings, takes up a towel and washes the feet of his disciples. This act of humility not only demonstrated his love, but also pointed to something much deeper. As we unpack this story, we'll see how Jesus didn't just wash their feet. He carried their dirt and ours all the way to the cross.
Back at the house, the disciples were busily working their way around the kitchen in preparation for the Passover. The room was perfumed with bowls of apples, cinnamon, and fresh herbs that sat atop the counter. The fire carried the smell of unleavened bread baking. A flagon of wine was perched at the center of the table, surrounded by wooden cups of various shapes and sizes. Judas entered quietly through the front door, just as Simon stepped in through the back. In his arms he had a wide tray with a whole roasted lamb. He set it down on the table with the rest of the food the disciples had brought over.
The lamb looks exquisite. I'd kill for a taste right now.
That's a little on the nose, don't you think, Simon? I thought your days of zealotry were over.
Very funny, John. You know what I meant.
Judas slithered back to the back of the room like a serpent. The jostling disciples didn't seem to notice, but Jesus did. He was sitting at the table and nodded at Judas as he welcomed him in.
Judas, we were getting worried. It looks like we're all here now. If you would, come and have a seat around the table with me. We can do the last of the preparations for the meal.
The disciples looked at each other in confusion. They had spent all afternoon preparing, as Jesus had instructed them to do. But they were hesitant to admit they had forgotten something.
Everything else in here is done. What else is there to prepare?
Why, yourselves, of course.
Thomas turned back to see if any of the other disciples understood what Jesus meant by this. Their stares confirmed that they were just as lost as he was. Jesus coaxed them to the table, gesturing for them to take their seats. Each of the disciples was glad to be off their feet.
Lord, aren't you going to eat with us?
Yes, Peter, but there is something very important that must be done first.
Once they took their seats, Jesus rose to his feet. Without another word, Jesus stepped out of the room. The silence lingered. A minute later, Jesus returned, carrying a jug of water and an empty basin. The water sloshed as Jesus carefully brought it to the table. He set the vessels down on the ground with a gentle thud. The disciples were puzzled, but said nothing. Jesus left the room once more. When he returned, the disciples saw that he had taken off his outer robes and replaced them with a towel tied around his waist. Though it was clean, the rag was visibly stained with dirt. Jesus walked back over to the jug. He lifted it from the ground and began to pour some out into the basin in a steady stream. It pitter-pattered against the wood. He knelt down beside the basin that was positioned in front of Thomas. The disciple looked at Jesus, bewildered. He tried to speak but was unable to form any words. Jesus met his eye. Thomas froze. He had never seen Jesus like this. The same man that Thomas had seen preach to thousands and gave sight to the blind knelt before him in the garments of a servant.
If you would.
Jesus' voice was soft as he took Thomas' foot in his hand. He loosed the straps of the sandal to the sound of caked-on mud breaking. It was beginning to sink in what Jesus was doing. He was going to wash their feet. The Messiah had taken on the job of a servant. Without any hesitation, he delicately wiped off Thomas' left foot, then his right. He continued to do this around the table. Once he finished with one disciple, he would affably move on to the next. Jesus came to Judas and looked up at the disciple. Judas's eyes were filled with a mix of fear, panic, and disillusionment. Jesus spoke no louder than a whisper, so only the lone disciple could hear.
Come. Yes, even you, Judas.
Judas' heart sank. What had he meant by this? Did he know? Judas wondered silently to himself. Surely if Jesus knew Judas planned to betray him, he wouldn't be washing his feet along with everyone else's. Judas stuck out his feet and allowed Jesus to wipe them free of the mud. As he watched, he thought about his run-in with the merchant in the street. He recalled the man's blessing of Adonai's presence and peace. He questioned his collusion with the chief priests. But a weight in his heart anchored him to his decision to betray the rabbi. He snapped out of his daze as Jesus tied his sandals back to his feet. He desperately tried to catch a glimpse of any sign that Jesus was aware of his plans. But to Judas, Jesus had treated him just as he always had, and showed no partiality in the washing of his feet. Jesus moved the basin over and knelt down once more. As Jesus leaned over, Peter sat upright in his chair. He pulled his feet back slightly. He had been given time to think as the other disciples' feet were washed. He mustered up the courage to question Jesus' actions.
Lord, are you going to wash my feet?
Jesus remained stoic. Without looking up, he responded,
I understand that right now you do not realize what I'm doing, but I promise later you will understand.
Peter thought hard. Was this a challenge? A test? Peter was one of the three who knew Jesus' true identity. The Son of God had been transformed before his very eyes, and now he was before him, in the dirt, preparing to clean his feet. Peter couldn't allow himself to believe that the greatest among them had taken the lowest position.
No, I cannot allow it. You shall never wash my feet.
Peter was proud of his determination. He hadn't succumbed to allow Jesus to perform such a humiliating act on him. Jesus gradually lifted his face to meet Peter's eyeline.
Peter, unless I wash you, you have no part with me.
Jesus didn't raise his voice when he spoke, but Peter felt terror ripple through his entire being when he heard the words spoken. Peter realized that he had mistaken the Lord's act of humility as an act of humiliation. He couldn't fathom having no part with Jesus. Every fear that Jesus washed away seemed to flood into Peter's soul in an instant. He swung the pendulum hard in the opposite direction in his desperation to rectify the situation. Now it was his turn to humble himself to the work Jesus was doing.
Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Wash all of me, for I am a sinner.
When Peter first met Jesus, he begged the rabbi to depart from him because he was a sinner. Now the weight of sin was the very reason he begged Jesus to remain with him.
Those who have taken a bath are already clean. They only need to wash their feet clean of the dirt picked up throughout the day. Those who have taken a bath are already clean. They only need to wash their feet clean of the dirt picked up throughout the day. As my followers, you are all already clean. Though I will admit, not every one of you is clean.
Judas tensed. Was this an acknowledgement of his knowing? But Jesus didn't stop to allow Judas to process any further.
I am simply here to remind you to rid yourselves of the day's filth.
With an enlightened understanding of Jesus' intentions, the disciples extended their gratitude as Jesus finished washing their feet. Once completed, he pressed himself onto his feet with a jug and basin in hand. The disciples marveled at the sight. The towel around Jesus' waist was filthy. The dirt and mud that once covered them now clung to him. Jesus made his way out of the room once more. He returned, cleaned, and in his regular garments once more. He took the empty seat at the table.
Do you understand what I've done for you?
The disciples didn't respond. They were still grappling with the gesture of Jesus' servanthood.
You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right to do so, for that is what I am. And as your Lord and teacher, I have washed your feet. As my disciples, you should wash one another's feet. Everything I have done tonight, I have done as an example for you. What you have seen me do as your master, I exhort you to do as well. For no servant is greater than his master, nor is a servant greater than the one who sent him. Wherever you go, do what I have taught you to do, and you will be blessed.
Once again, Jesus was radically upending their understanding of him and his kingdom. The master had become the servant. They were to follow in his example of humility. The world knew they needed a Messiah, but the ways they would be blessed by him were unimaginable. He would take their own filth upon himself so that they could be made clean.
Imagine the scene. It's the night before Jesus will be crucified. He's gathered with his disciples for what would be their final meal together. The air is thick with tension and unspoken worries. Jesus knew what was about to happen. He knew that his hour had come, that he was about to leave this world and return to the Father. But instead of focusing on his own impending suffering, Jesus' thoughts were on his disciples. The Bible tells us, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. John chapter 13, verse 1. In the middle of this meal, Jesus does something unexpected. He gets up, takes off his outer garments, wraps a towel around his waist, and begins to wash the disciples' feet. This wasn't just any task. It was the job of the lowest servant in the household. In those days, people wore sandals and walked on dusty roads, so foot washing was a necessary but lowly task. You can almost see the disciples' puzzled looks. Peter, who often speaks up first, even objects. Lord, are you washing my feet? John chapter 13, verse 6. Jesus replies, What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. John chapter 13, verse 7. Peter, still not getting it, insists, You shall never wash my feet. But Jesus, ever patient, says, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. John chapter 13, verse 8. Now, let's pause and think about the symbolism here. Jesus is washing their feet with a towel, and that towel is getting dirty. The filth from their feet is transferred onto the towel. This is a vivid picture of what Jesus would do on the cross. He didn't just wash away dirt. He took on our dirtiness, our sin, our shame, our guilt. Just as that towel became dirty, Jesus bore our sins in his body on the cross. He wore our dirtiness so that we could be made clean. The act of washing feet wasn't just about physical cleanliness. It was about spiritual cleansing. It was a foreshadowing of the ultimate act of service that Jesus would perform on the cross. He didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Mark chapter 10, verse 45. After washing their feet, Jesus explains the lesson. He says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." John chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. Jesus isn't just telling them to start a foot washing ministry, though that's a beautiful practice in itself. He's teaching them and us that true greatness in his kingdom is found in serving others. Jesus set the bar for humility and service incredibly high. If the Lord of all creation is willing to wash feet, what does that say about how we should treat one another? If the King of Kings didn't consider any task too lowly, then no task is beneath us. This act of foot washing is a perfect example of the three loves we talked about last time: love God, love one another, and love on mission. Love God. Jesus' actions were rooted in his love for the Father. He knew who he was, where he came from, and where he was going. John chapter 13, verse 3. His service flowed out of his secure relationship with the Father. When we love God, we naturally express that love in humble service. Love one another. Jesus didn't just talk about love, he showed it. He loved his disciples to the end, and he demonstrated that love by washing their feet. We're called to do the same, to serve one another in love, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's messy. Love on mission. Jesus' mission was to serve and to save. By washing his disciples' feet, he showed them the kind of selfless love that would characterize their mission to the world. As we go out on mission, we're called to serve others, to get our hands dirty, just as Jesus did. So, what does this mean for us today? It's simple. Go and do likewise. Serve one another with humility. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty, to step into the messiness of life, and to show the love of Christ in practical ways, whether it's through a kind word, a helping hand, or a listening ear. We have countless opportunities to wash one another's feet. Let's remember that Jesus wore our dirtiness on the cross so that we could be clean. Let's follow his example, serving one another with the same love and humility that he showed us. Because when we do, we're not just washing feet, we're reflecting the heart of Jesus to a world that desperately needs him.